To whom does the future of Canada belong? Canada and its relationship with its indigenous peoples has always been a disgraceful disaster. Bill Gallagher, the author of Resource Requiem, says from the introduction of the Indian Act to now, one disastrous policy after another has pretended to move us forward toward reconciliation, when in fact, as he says, they have barely moved the needle. Gallagher says we live under the illusion that we are working together in an atmosphere of improving relations. That the Tsilhqot'in Supreme Court Ruling, along with Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution and the acceptance of the guiding principles of UNDRIP, are bringing us together and providing First Nations with the rights they so justly deserve. Add in more than 325 court case rulings that all went in favor of First Nations claiming title and rights to lands and resources, and you'd think we'd be working hard to figure out how to work together to create economic opportunities that will benefit all of us. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Gallagher says, in fact, the opposite is true. We are at a crossroads where it is impossible to build anything, and the losers are all of us. I invited Bill Gallagher, the author of Resource Requiem, to join me for a conversation that matters about how we got to now and where we may not be able to go to. Hi, Bill. Thank you for joining me.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
That
was a proper introduction.
Yeah, it's pretty harsh, though. It's pretty harsh, though, isn't it?
Well, things are winding down in the resources sector. There's a retrenchment going on. Who in their right mind would want to, spend $1 billion in the current environment of political uncertainty? So that's the underlying thesis of the book. The only people who are building projects of that caliber tend to be governments, and some are actually bankrupting themselves in the process. So I see a reality that the mainstream media is scared of reporting. It's a rather dire turn of events. When I wrote my first book 15 years ago, Resource Rulers, I predicted that First Nations would in fact decide the fate of resource projects. I never would have foreseen the fact that they would have turned inward and basically developed a point of view that if we can't have it, you can't have it. And they've aligned with the eco-activist movement with the interest of prioritizing the protection of Mother Earth. That's an awful lot for a resource company to take on, to say, hey, we can work through this together and we have an advantage that we want to put on the table for you.
So, Bill, when you first wrote Resource Rulers, my sense of it was you were saying, okay, this is the changing landscape. That's fine. Understand it. Work with indigenous communities within their territories. Find opportunities, and then everybody benefits. And you weren't at the time looking at it as saying that this is a negative. You were spelling out what the facts were.
I was following the evidence. I was following the evidence that lawyers and large firms were ignoring. I had to become a one-man band, and they basically cast me as pro-native. I'm not particularly. I'm basically saying this is a social movement. It's based in conflict studies. It turns out that through playing by our rules, the 3% minority of our population are the most empowered. They're also the most dispossessed. And we are now, 15 years later, reaping the winds of the fact that we have ignored what I would take to be a heads up to Canada that we've got to be smarter and more strategic. Otherwise, we're going to basically keep digging a hole for ourselves. And if we want to have a robust revenue flow from natural resources, we have to make profound changes. That transitioned into my second book, Resource Reckoning, The first book came out at 150 indigenous legal wins. The second book, Reckoning, came out at 250. There I got a little more pointed in my admonishments. I basically said that unless we change our ways, we will be putting ourselves on the ropes in the resources sector. The indigenous win streak has continued. It's even picked up momentum. And today at 329 legal wins, they are more than calling the shots on how projects will fare. They're actually setting out terms of reference for how anybody in broader society has to engage on their sovereign rights. So it's turned into a compendium of legal empowerment that basically has them saying, we're in the driver's seat. All along I've been saying they're in the passenger seat, but they're saying they're in the driver's seat.
So why shouldn't they be in the driver's seat? You know, if you go back and take a look at the history of Canada, the way in which Indigenous people were taken from their lands, and you know, you can point to the Royal Proclamation of 1763. No, so many of these nations ceded ownership. Indian Act and everything. And so why shouldn't we put these people back in that rightful position where they say, well, this is our land. We can decide what's going to happen here. You guys showed up and took it away from us.
That's right. They wouldn't ask the question that way. They would.
No.
It's not up to us to put them back in their rightful place. They're simply assuming their rightful place and letting the chips fall where they may. And one of the big chips is resource access to their traditional lands. And they're fighting a much larger overarching battle with the colonial governments. And they're basically saying until we get proper recognition of the empowerment that we wield, plus the fact that we have on top of that our own inherent rights, traditional governments, all this sort of stuff, that you guys can go pound sand. And you know, the only people that are showing up to engage with them are resource sector types who are not equipped to address, or maybe aren't even aware of the seismic changes afoot in terms of how Indigenous peoples are standing up to the rest of Canada.
You know, I'm on both sides of the issue here. I want to be able to, of course, see economic activity move forward to the benefit of all. So when I talk to somebody like Chris Sankey, and he would agree with you, he says, you know, environmentalists are showing up like environmental colonialists. That's his term, saying to a First Nation, I'm going to show you how to thwart that resource project. But in the meantime, the First Nation in that particular territory then no longer has access to any kind of opportunity. And then the environmentalists get what they want and they leave, and the community is still destitute. So I go, well, that's not right. But at the same time, I go, okay, there's been an awful lot of wrongs in Canada. And if I was one of those people on the receiving end of it, I'd go, well, you don't like it right now? Too bad.
In fairness, the other member of the equation is the eco-activist movement, and they have a robust legal winning streak in their own right. After the Dakota Access Pipeline blowout 4 years ago, there were probably 1,000 Native strategists and eco-activists from Canada down there at the barricades, taking on the security services of Dakota Access. And that was such a public and such an egregious conflict that they returned to Canada motivated on a number of points. They embraced, or they allowed, the eco-activist movement in. Now, the eco-activist movement didn't just get a pass because of Dakota Access. They were very strategic and had been actively aligning with Indigenous communities for years, hoping to get validation that they could have a hand in helping First Nations take the lead in strategizing on resource projects. But this was a firecracker that set everybody off, and on returning to Canada, a number of trends occurred that we hadn't seen before. The land back movement all of a sudden popped up. There are land backers down there in the lobster conflict on the East Coast. There are land backers down there in Caledonia and land backers out there on the Coastal Gas Pipeline. There's an alignment with the anarchist movement that never previously popped up, but it's in some of these, not all of these conflicts that I've mentioned. And we're seeing what I call hardliners set the tone. And what's troubling about that is there's no compromise with the hardliners. And that's what Minister Carolyn Bennett found out when she ended up doing her secret deal out there on the Coastal Gas project. It was secret because she couldn't explain it to anybody because of the hardline sentiments that she was facing down. That's the best she could do. It smacks on incompetence to me, but that's where we are with governments running scared. Federal and provincial governments are running scared on the road to resources in the face of this hardline aspect and the overwhelming Native empowerment uplift that I've been documenting.
So let's take a look at the Wet'suwet'en issue with the Coastal Gas Pipeline. You know, Wet'suwet'en is more than just one First Nation. It's a coming together of I think 6 or 7 First Nations. 6 of the 7 are all in favor of the pipeline. There's one that isn't, and yet there's a divide between the elected council and the hereditary chiefs. And even then, it's suspect as to who 1 or 2 of those hereditary chiefs was and what their relationship was with, with that First Nation. It comes down to 1 or 2 people then who are standing in the way of a project. I don't want to use the word progress because some people would say it's not, but it's a project. It brings opportunity and benefit to that community. And I know this firsthand because I've been there. I've talked to councillors on the elected council. And they went, I know I'm taking a little bit of a sidebar, but I was there with one of them. He says, well, there's already a natural gas pipeline that runs through our territory. It was built there 60 or 70 years ago. And he said, you know what's remarkable about that old gas pipeline? Nobody asked us if they could put it through. They just came along, put it through. And he said, we can't even get natural gas into our own community. He said, we got to drive by truck into the nearest town and go get propane to heat our houses. He said, this new pipeline that's coming through, they're already giving us money. Once it's built, they've confirmed that we're going to be getting natural gas into our community. Like, they see all kinds of benefits. And then they see this, as you say, this alignment with some people who feel empowered to stop it. Oh, I don't know. The question is, where are we at now if it can come down to that, to stop a project, and then what's the likelihood of us being able to attract others who say, that's okay, we can still work our way through this?
Well, that's a very good analysis as to actually what the truth behind that pipeline is. That storyline that you just laid out, a narrative, is not the narrative that mainstream media is reporting on. I mean, the hardliners are playing mainstream media like a powwow drum, and as they are propaganda specialists. I tip my hat to them on that. It's amazing what mainstream media will swallow in the reports out of the Maurice River. The reality is that you use the word Wet'suwet'en. They're on board with this project, as is every other First Nation along the right-of-way. That's quite an achievement. That's 20 out of 20. So the hardliners, who, in my opinion, are not legitimate hereditary appointees, they've bamboozled the media to see them as such. They are master propaganda manipulators, and it plays into the mainstream media's preferred narrative right across the country on any issue to treat Indigenous peoples as losers. Okay. Hard done by. historically screwed over by the colonial heritage of this country. Where I come along and basically say, 329 legal wins later, these are the biggest winners in Canadian legal history. Right. These guys are calling the shots on the outcome of any project, any procedure that might be applied in that project, and they should be given credit for beating us at our own game because we set up the legal system. And basically, the only reason the eco-activists have worked so hard to get a ticket in is that they know that while they have a decent win streak, the Indigenous winning streak is where the real power lies. And they have, I've heard them give presentations at seminars whereby they promise, after a year of sweat lodges and this sort of stuff, you always get to have the final say and will be in front of the microphones, not us, okay? So they're in there cementing their narrative, and that's totally based on prioritizing Mother Earth, which is a legitimate point of view. I mean, how can I argue with that? I like the cathedral forest and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I've been out there and, that's amazing stuff. But there's no compromise with them. And they're part of the energy that's fueled this no compromise dynamic that I think is basically in advance curtailing many, many resource projects that are still on the drawing board. They're just not going to happen.
So by circumstance, I was walking down the street in Vancouver a little while ago and came upon a protest that had shut down one of the main intersections, and I happened to be passing through there. Somebody tries to hand me a pamphlet and I go, okay, what's it for? And they said, join us in standing with the Wet'suwet'en people to stop the pipeline. And I went, oh, do you know where Wet'suwet'en is? And the guy goes, yeah, it's in northern BC. I went, well, that's an awfully big territory. Like, where in northern BC? Hang on a second. Goes and gets a guy, comes over and he says, it's near Terrace. I went, okay, how close to Terrace? Have you been there? And they hadn't been there. They don't know what they're talking about. They're standing with people that they don't even know. The issue isn't Native or Indigenous empowerment. It's a natural gas pipeline that these people didn't want to see go through. But as we point out, and we've gone off track here a little bit, but the reality is we have a situation where First Nations and Indigenous peoples have a tremendous access to opportunity to be able to realize potential for themselves within their own communities. And as Chris Sankey, who's from Prince Rupert, points out, we've got these environmental colonialists coming in and leaving us worse off. So Bill, what do we do about this? Like, where can we go? Or is this just our fate? And then what does that say?
I think it is our fate. I mean, I'd like to think that the federal Liberal government would want to, would be concerned about missed opportunities, economic development opportunities. But my belief is they're totally hooked on the human rights narrative. They've embraced the United Nations Declaration, which is important. I mean, I've attended sessions from the drafters themselves talking about it. The word veto does not appear and was never discussed in the drafting of the UN Declaration. But the upswing is that the feds don't really have much say in resources. They have a big ministry, but it's the provinces who have jurisdiction over resource development in all of Canada, short of the territories. And the territories are cross-piled with land claims and unique governments like Nunavut. And the feds only have a passenger seat say in how resource developments happen there. So there's no real momentum or requirement for the feds to basically show leadership in resource development. So the provinces are left on their own. I'm saying that a small province or an underpopulated province taking on the Native empowerment movement, combined with the eco-activist movement, is no contest.
So then what future do those First Nations have? You know, I've been to Haisla, talked to the current Chief Councillor, Crystal Smith, and then former Chief Councillor Ellis Ross. They go, look, at the best thing you can do is create an opportunity where somebody can have a job.
I'm glad you mentioned those two. I mean, the Haisla is the reason this whole coastal gas pipeline's being built,
Yes.
and the connection to LNG to get a preferred, a less carbon intensive component into the atmosphere than otherwise would be, which bitumen or coal. They broke the mold, those two folks that you mentioned.
Yes.
These hardliners are undoing the consensus that those folks have developed right across that pipeline right away. Mm-hmm. And, you know, why should they get away with it? Why doesn't media report it as underhanded? Because it is.
Well, I don't know if you know about the First Nations LNG Alliance here in British Columbia. It represents all those nations along that line who have all said, yes, we're in favor of this. They get ignored by the media.
That's right. Mainstream media is really caught out and looking bad in my books. I don't go looking for airtime or interview time with mainstream media. When I tweet, I'll put something out as, okay, this is the CBC version of the following story, and then I'll put my message at the bottom to look a little deeper into it. It's just it's a narrative that has been set in stone primarily by Truth and Reconciliation and the 96 calls to action. That's the narrative the Liberal government is running with. That's the narrative the CBC is running with. That's the narrative that is giving all this new terminology about, you know, slamming colonial this and colonial that. And all, you know, it used to be that a land acknowledgement was a proper, balanced, welcome development where, to a person like me, yes, there are two indigenous people have treaties. We have treaties too. We're the other half of that treaty. We have obligations. But they've since morphed into a total guilt trip, which just has got this loser concept just ingrained in it, and I think is very counterproductive. So,
well, yeah, I'll agree with you. Unfortunately, Bill, we're out of time. But I'm going to encourage people to look at all of your books, including your upcoming one, Resource Requiem. Thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Great.